A warm welcome from the whole board, a warm welcome from my dear colleague, Peter Clement, who's in obviously part of the organization committee. It is a great joy to start this event. It is part of a series, Climate Change Matters, which we've initiated back in 2020. And we would like to today look at the supply chains and why they matter. I would like to share, though, a few slides, which I'm going to do right now. And I would first like to say something because we have a number of registrants from outside of the MIT Club. And I would like to just briefly say, what is the MIT Club of Germany? So we are a volunteer organization. Everyone who's working here is doing it and in their spare time because we believe in our connection to MIT. We believe in the topics that we discuss. We have about 700 alumni living in Germany that are on our radar. We have a new LinkedIn site, which has about 600 connections, which has grown dramatically, and we're trying to link these alumni. Some of them are full members, not all of them, and full members means they are actually active part of it. And of course, in these members, they are invited to the annual general meeting. We have various other events and a big initiative called Schule mit Wissenschaft. It's with a focus on teachers, trying to inspire teachers. We have various events like this one, but of course also in normal times, events that are physical, which is the main, I think, the main focus. However, that actually said, we are discovering that this format is allowing us to reach many more people, which is great, and we're going to keep it as a hybrid format. Now, when we set up the Climate Change Matters series, it was because we usually choose a topic that we like to pursue in some depth over a period of around 1, 2, maybe even 3 years. So it's quite flexible. And despite all the corona disruptions, one of the critical topics that is in the background that is not going away is, of course, the climate change. And in fact, one could argue that corona is one of the problems we have because of climate change and encroachment of wildlife habitat. So what we've done as a panel or as a board, we've put together different formats. And today is the expert panel format. We also have a fireside chat format, which is more intimate. It's just one-on-one, and it's not as professionally moderated. It's one-on-one, meaning 2 panelists that then also discuss in a dialogue. We have a speaker event format where we will invite speakers moving forward to just give a speech as we know it. And we have a workshop that is in the making. And climate change clearly is the focus of all of these. And it's different aspects of climate change: education, business, it's not, of course, organizational issues and policy, and sometimes or mostly they actually connect between all of them. And in fact, we now also would like to make this quite interactive. And wait a second, I'm just getting a little message. We would like to make this interactive, and we would like to invite you to ask questions. There is a Q&A box that you will have, so please, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. That is important. And when you write questions at the time when we open up the panel for discussion, we will have to filter them, and we will take some of those questions. We kindly ask you to please first put the name, who you're asking this question to, and then put your question. And whatever questions we cannot answer, we will collate them, and we will then try to answer them in writing and circulate that to everyone who's registered. And then now, of course, it's my big pleasure to introduce Laura. Laura Hesse-Fischer is at MIT, engaged at MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. She's a prolific, internationally active believer in sustainable issues, who's been working on this for many years now. She's, amongst others, she's been working precisely to bridge the gap between public, private, non-governmental organizations. She's worked in them. She's trying to get awareness out and actually finding ways of finding practical solutions to challenging some of those environmental problems that we have. And some, of course, include waste management. It's of course, also green building, various things. And I'm sure there's much more you can find when you look her up. She's also active as a founder and leader of Civic Series. We've included the web address, civicseries.org, if you want to look up this. And we're delighted that she's willing and able to take us through today's event, and also to introduce the topic, as well as the speakers who are also taking their time to add to this discussion. So thank you so much already now. And Laura, if I may, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you for that, that kind introduction. So for folks who are not familiar, the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative was founded in 2014, and we're really tasked with mobilizing the MIT capacity to contribute to addressing climate change and other environmental challenges. And so related to the topic that we'll talk about today, we have a plastics and environment program and metals, minerals, and the environment program. Both are industries which are poised to grow in the coming decade as the world shifts to a low carbon economy. So you can check out ESI at esi.mit.edu. But in the meantime, we have today's wonderful panel, and thanks again to Wolfgang and Peter for organizing this. So COVID has made the issue of supply chains very real for most people, whether it's basic supplies, toilet paper obviously made the news, or much more pertinent things like vaccines and testing equipment. You might have also seen the headlines about Evergiven, AI supplier assessments, PC chip shortages, all this is pointing to this is a very critical and timely topic. So today we're taking a broad look at supply chains and the transformation that's needed to slow climate change and eliminate human rights issues. We're going to look at the challenges from the perspectives of the consumer and the producer, and also logistics provider. And we have an excellent panel for you today representing new tech, the shipping industry, and fair trade. So how this event is going to go is I'm going to introduce all of the speakers in the order in which they will present. We'll start with a 10-minute talk from each of them, and then I'll pose some questions so we can have a little bit of a discussion. And we invite you, as Wolfgang said, at any time to submit your questions using the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat feature. Please use the Q&A feature. And then we'll open it up to Q&A after that. And then I'll pass it over to Wolfgang and Peter to wrap it up. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce this panel. We have Dr. Leonardo Bonnani. He's the founder and CEO of SourceMap, which is an MIT spinoff whose platform is used by businesses and governments to track their supply chains and manage programs aimed at eliminating critical issues such as forced labor, deforestation, and extreme poverty. He holds a PhD from the MIT Media Lab. We have Maersk Peter Sacco. He's the head of industry transition at the Maersk McKinney-Moller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. He's worked in shipping for 17 years, most recently as CEO for J. Lauritsen AS before he was a CFO in Torm and CFO in Pfizer. And he spent the first 10 years of his career in the financial industry in Denmark. And we have Juan Pablo Solis. He's the senior advisor for climate and environment at FairTrade International. He's an economist with an academic background in economic policies, ecological economy, and sustainable development. So welcome to our speakers. And Leonardo, I'll pass it off to you to start with your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to share some slides today for my brief introduction. It won't be long. Name is Leonardo Bonnani. I'm the founder and CEO of a technology company called SourceMap that I started out of the MIT Media Lab 10 years ago. Our job is to help make sense of global supply chains and all of the social and environmental risks inherent in them. And we do that through the application of supply chain transparency and traceability. The reason companies come to us, there are many reasons, but all of them converge on the same thing. And it's something you just heard about, which is supply chains have been stretched very thin. And every year, it seems like you hear about something going on somewhere in someone's supply chain that is totally outside the norms and the standards that we would expect. and whether that impacts your ability to deliver products, the quality of your products, or the social or environmental impact you have, these problems are going to continue to creep up as supply chains have to get more and more global to satisfy greater and greater demand for more and more complex things. So that's where SourceMap comes in. We help companies avoid these problems before they happen. Our specialty is dealing with the extended supply chain. So helping companies go all the way to the origin of every raw material that they buy, because those raw materials are where the biggest risks lie. It's also where the least technology has been applied. So when we go to a cocoa farm, or we go to a palm oil plantation or a mica mine, almost inevitably, all of the record keeping is done on paper. And that means there's almost no traceability, no visibility to the brand that is ultimately benefiting from those raw materials. Those brands could be 5, 6, 7, 8 tiers downstream. So we have a combination of the highest risks and the lowest visibility at the raw material end of the supply chain. The solution we have been implementing with our customers for the past decade is one that is entirely human. It's a social solution. It's a social network, in fact, because the reason these companies can't mitigate all these risks is that there are hundreds of thousands of suppliers in a typical multinational supply chain, if you consider the suppliers who supply the suppliers and the suppliers who supply those suppliers, all the way to each and every farm and every mine. And so we built a social network. It's a database that is 100 or 1,000 times bigger than SAP for each of our customers. And it's one that works just like a social network in the sense that you send invites and they cascade. And that means they also cascade to places where there is no internet, there is no electricity, there's very limited access to technology, and certainly there's no advanced inventory management technology. And so that means we have mobile apps that are used that work offline. We have very lean inventory management solutions. We rely on technology that can be widely adopted, and I mean by the entire global supply chain. And so that means a lot of appropriate technology. What do we get as a result? Our customers get a map of their supply chain that goes for every raw material into extreme detail. And this is just one example of one such map, which was generated for the footwear industry when they were investigating whether their purchases of leather were contributing to deforestation in the Amazon. And what we do through the cascading data requests is we find out the tanneries, we find the slaughterhouses, we find the farms, and then we overlay that with satellite imagery indicating fires and forestry change that is indicative of deforestation. And that data is updated almost in real time. And inevitably, you'll see very clear patterns. In this case, the slaughterhouse is moving closer and closer to the red belt of the Amazon where the fires were happening in that summer of 2019. And our customers come away with that having to make some tough decisions at times. In this case, a lot of footwear makers decided based on this data that they couldn't do business unless they were being able to be reassured that they were not contributing to deforestation. And those decisions have a big impact. In this case, Bolsonaro was forced to put a moratorium on the fires that he had permitted in the summer of 2019 in response to industry boycott. But it's not all negative. It's not all boycotts. Brands have also learned to make money by being more transparent. B2C companies are sharing vast amounts of data on their supply chains. This is one example of one very well-regarded brand for millennials that is sharing its supply chain down to the 4th tier. So suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, something that they know almost nobody can do. And they do it because they know that it will establish trust with their consumers and it'll establish trust with their suppliers as well. We see that happening with B2C, but we also see it happening with B2B companies, because effectively in a competitive marketplace, if you can differentiate your product because it has less risk, it has more transparency, it has a better social and environmental impact, then you can stand out from the competition very easily. And I'll just close by saying that this crazy idea that supply chains will be transparent is no longer crazy at all. And in just the last 4 years, the US enforcement of a ban on the products of forced labor entering the US has forced industry to go a completely new direction, which is instead of corporate social responsibility, they have to actually embed traceability and social responsibility in their purchasing. It can no longer be considered a separate function. Supply chains have to be responsible, they have to be transparent, and it's a completely new way of doing business. And in fact, Germany is next to implement a law around supply chain transparency, specifically to tackle the problem of forced labor. And with that, I'll leave you, but I know there's a lot of industries, a lot of people, and a lot of applications. So I'll be happy to take your questions also after this offline if you just email me.
Thanks so much, Leonardo. And I appreciate how you wrapped up with the interplay that policy and new technology and corporate practice have. So next we'll hear from Maersk Peter Sacco, who is the head of industry transition at the Maersk McKinney Moeller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. Maersk, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you so much for the privilege. I've really been looking forward to this. So I look forward to an engaged discussion after my short presentation and Juan Pablo. So yeah, I'll also just share my screen here. And Laura, if you can see it, please wave. Good. We show the world it's possible. This is the, I represent the Maersk McKinney Moeller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. And that means, of course, that looking at shipping here, climate is a very pertinent issue, and it's something that we're spending a lot of time on. Shipping is by far the most friendly way of transportation. It's the most efficient, as you can imagine. About 80 to 90% of all global transportation, if you measure by ton mile, is actually done via shipping. So it is a very big and important part of the supply chain. But it also means that we currently have about 70,000 vessels on the deep oceans, and they are consuming about 300 million tons of heavy fuel oil every year. That means that we are emitting about 3% of the total CO2 emissions. And that may be not sounding like a very big number to you, but if we convert that into about 1 billion tons of CO2 every year, you can see the scale of the problem right now. Action is clearly needed, and this is why our center has been put into the world. Our center has a mission to be a visible force in the global maritime decarbonization. So it's very simple. The only thing we do is to try and get CO2 out of the shipping sector. Our center has been founded and funded in 2020 by the A.P. Møller Foundation. So we are an independent, self-owned global research and development center, only focusing on the decarbonization. So we are neutral and independent and driven by our mission. Our center here is planning to have about 100 specialists, that being chemical engineers or being naval architects or other specialists in the field of shipping and fuels. We have 40 right now, but we are ramping up quickly with the aim of being about 100 by next year. So it is a very significant resource that we are putting together to tackle this climate problem. The most important resource of our center is the partnerships that we have put together here. And you can see some 13 global leaders. They're representing companies from all parts of the world. We have European companies, we have American companies, and we have Asian companies as well. They are all contributing to our center by bringing projects that will, you could say, work specifically on developing technologies or in other ways try to eliminate the emissions from the shipping industry. In addition to projects, they are also bringing on board 3 to 5 people to the center, each of them. So that means that we have a massive resource base here, not only having people, you could say, on board our center doing the research together with our staff, but also acting as ambassadors and anchors into the organizations that you're looking at here. So it truly is a very large effort and a very large commitment by all these global companies to decarbonize for real. You'll also see we have a couple of knowledge partners, and you will probably note here that there are not any universities present at the time, but it would of course be wonderful if we could get one highly esteemed first-class American university also on this list at some point in time, because leveraging our work together with the universities would of course make a big impact as well. What we're saying here is that it can be done, and it can, but decarbonization is not going to happen by itself. If you look at this analysis that we have based on our techno-economic modeling, you can see that if we don't do anything, if suddenly the focus on climate suddenly disappeared, we all went back to fossil fuels and enjoyed the ride, you would see here that the emissions from shipping itself would climb by more than 50% over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But that, you may also say, is not a super interesting analysis, because of course climate is here with us. We can see it every day that it's changing and that we need to do something about it. The path that we are on is what we call the most realistic scenario if we continue what we're doing right now. And mind you, there are a lot of interesting activities going on. There are shipping companies changing their ways. There is regulation that's being changed. But there are also other things that are working against decarbonization of shipping. The major one, of course, being that trade volumes are growing. That's not a bad thing in itself. It's good for economic development, but it does mean that the challenge for shipping is growing, and it means that we need to work harder to decarbonize. Another very important part is that the spreads currently and in the near future, the spreads between fossil fuel prices and the cost of these zero emission fuels, they are very, very wide at this point in time, and they'll continue to be so for a while. And those two factors in themselves makes, you could say, all the good initiatives that we are doing right now just end up with perhaps 6% increase in CO2 emissions over the next 30 years, which is clearly not satisfactory to anybody in the industry or outside the industry. I think one of the most important points that we've learned from our analysis is that there's no silver bullet that will close that cost gap. There's no one thing that we need to do to get to zero carbon. But our modeling has shown that it can be done. And you can see the graph here that there is a way to net zero to full decarbonization. But it does mean that we need to activate a great number of levers. One of them, of course, is on the technology front. And this is where we and others, of course, are working on concrete projects to, you could say, improve the efficiency of solid oxide fuel cells and similar projects. This is a very important part of what our center is doing and what a number of commercial companies are looking into. I'd like to mention here energy efficiency. The best way that we can bring down the climate or the carbon footprint of the shipping industry is to consume less fuel, to use less energy. And here we actually have quite a number of things that can be done for the whole sector to, you could say, operate the vessels more efficiently or use technology to reduce our energy consumption. So it's a very important part of the journey. But there's also the customer side, the willingness to pay. We are already seeing a number of shipping companies are having customers calling saying, hey, guys, when can you deliver zero carbon transportation? And then that quickly turns into a price discussion, of course. How much are you willing to pay to get, in the first instance, biofuel drop-ins that can deliver zero carbon transportation already now? But in the longer run, you would have other types of fuels that will allow for zero carbon shipping. There's also the financial side. Will we see a green discount when you're investing into green technologies as opposed to fossil fuel? This is already developing and this is going to continue. We don't think that the banks all the investors will be willing to finance fossil fuel technology going forward. Then there's industry leadership. We're already seeing a number of shipping companies that have committed to zero carbon by 2050, but it's very concentrated in a few segments. There are also a couple of segments in the shipping industry, namely in the dry bulk industry and in the tanker industry, where we don't see a lot of leadership on the climate front happening right now. But we will try and find ways where we can exert pressure on those companies in order to have them commit to delivering zero carbon shipping. And then, of course, the most and last important part is the whole regulation side. And that's really what will be needed to close the gap. We will need to see private-public partnership to get this to the finishing line. We would need to see some sort of emissions restrictions so that it's a requirement that the ships become more efficient over time and consume less energy. But we will most likely also see what we call market-based measures, which could be something along carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes or the like, that will, you could say, help the industry decarbonize over time. One last point I maybe just want to make here is that the transition is going to require a lot of renewable energy. That's probably a little bit of a problem as we see it. Just decarbonizing shipping is probably going to require 1,000 gigawatts of renewable energy, and that we're not nearly close to that right now. And some of the other industries, of course, are also competing for those zero carbon fuels. That could be aviation, that could be heavy truck transportations, and of course, electrifying your homes with having heat pumps instead of oil-heated homes and so on. So there'll be a lot of competition for the green electrons, and therefore we need a lot of renewable energy going forward. So I think with that, I will hand it back to you, Laura, and say it can be done, but it requires a lot of work from all parties, and both the private and the public sector need to make an important effort here to get to the finishing line. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for ending on that positive note. Next, we have Juan Pablo, who is a senior advisor for climate and environment at FairTrade International. Juan Pablo.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me, and thanks for MIT Club of Germany for inviting us. Maybe let me start by explaining well, what is FairTrade and what do we do in this sustainable supply chain. FairTrade is a voluntary sustainability standard. Well, we are known for being one of the first voluntary sustainability standards, but the FairTrade philosophy goes a little bit beyond that. We try to work to frame trade on partnership between farmers and workers, and consumers as well. No, so in our view, farmers have the right to enjoy sustainable livelihood. So that is the philosophy behind FairTrade. That is why we put farmers and workers at the center of our activity. Now, based on different surveys and analysis that we ran with the farmers and workers that are part of FairTrade, climate change always rank first in the top priority of risks. And it's for nobody's surprises that between 2015 and 2020, we experienced the 6 warmest years in records, according to the World Meteorological Organization. The last report of the World Meteorological Organization says that 2020 was one of the warmest of the last 5 years. So actually what my colleagues are saying, yeah, climate change is here. We also have to bear in mind that if we are true with ourselves and we are keen to achieve SDGs, well, we are only 9 harvests away for achieving SDGs. SDGs is in 2030 and we are in 2021, so time is not so close to us. And lastly, the severity and frequency of meteorological events are on the rise. Significant examples happened last year with hurricanes in Central America or typhoons in Asia. Now, in the let's say, FairTrade Constellation, most of our activities relates to agriculture, although we do have standards for non-agricultural products like textiles or precious metals, but agriculture has a significant relevance in our sphere of work. We know that agriculture accounts for more like 20%, a fifth of all greenhouse gas emissions worldwide as a sector. The sector of land use, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses is more or less 20%. I do have some. I do have some. I cannot see it. Yeah, here. Some slides to enlighten what I'm trying to say. So, can you see? Yes.
We can, but can you put it in present mode? Or just zoom in a little bit? It's not showing us in present mode. You must have another screen.
It is now. Okay.
Maybe you can just zoom in. Yeah, present mode's not working for us for whatever reason.
Yeah, let me go back. What about now?
Great, thank you.
Okay, sorry for that technological issue. Well, again, as I was explaining, and these are maps based on data from FAO. The first map that you can see here is the total agricultural emissions per countries, and you see, for instance, big red colors in countries like China, United States, Brazil. But here you also can see the percentage of national emissions that comes from agriculture that is not including land use and land use change. And you can see a pattern here happening very clear in countries of, for instance, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So climate change in the agriculture sector is either seen as the cause of the problem, but also as a victim of climate change. Different forecasts tell us that the current land, if climate continues to change the way it is, the current areas of production will not be suitable for the same type of agriculture productions in the future. This is particularly the case in African countries, where the severity of events invite us to rethink these strategies. There are three things that we think are important. One is climate information. So how to understand and how to collect data that can help us to make decisions. The other thing is climate governance, how to make this partnership among producers and consumers and have people more aware of what is the problem and how to solve it. And the third is context-specific approaches. Among these climate-specific approaches, one of the things that we focus is on education, training. We have different climate academies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is a quote from one of our producers in Latin America, the Climate Change Leadership School. For them, it's very important to understand how to confront and how to create resilience. It is important to take care of the environment in order to become leaders. It's what Eduardo Romero tells us. So the voice of farmers for us is important to raise. We also ran different analyses to understand, for instance, the footprint of a product. These are two examples of roses in Kenya and bananas. And you see that, for instance, the footprint of a rose in Kenya is mostly related to transportation, because you have to have the fresh rose shipped in an aircraft in order to arrive, for instance, to the European markets. And you will say, well, that is tricky. Why you choose to buy a rose that is shipped from Kenya? But actually, it is interesting to see that the competition of these Kenyan roses are roses produced, for instance, in the Netherlands. And because of energy consumptions in factories in the Netherlands, actually the footprint of roses in Kenya is lower. So these are things that are important to bear in mind. Another example here is the case of bananas. In bananas as well, transportation make a significant part of the greenhouse emission, but actually it's on-farm activities that the ones that are generating this CO2 emission factor. So it how to understand what type of aspects of the context need to be considered to make the transition towards more sustainable practices and more climate resilience. That is what we try to put into the revision of our standards. We have standards for sustainable for smallholder producer organizations, but we also have a standard for high labor organizations, in which environmental criteria is very important in our point of view. And we engage commercial partners with producers in what we call offer to business. And most of these investments are trying to focus the attention on, for instance, how to stimulate reforestation programs or better characteristics of the farm. And another aspect that is very interesting in the FairTrade scope of work is the minimum price. We try to put always a minimum price as a backup scheme for guarantee better stability of production of producers. So this minimum price is a structure based on cost of sustainable production, and we understand that this is probably not enough. And that is why we are also working in FairTrade living income and living wage reference price to stimulate that conversation and that partnership. Because, well, if a producer is not earning a living income, well, the priority towards climate change will not be enough. Finally, we also have a FairTrade climate standard because we also know that producers are capable to generate carbon credits, and we think that compensating or offering FairTrade, the FairTrade philosophy in the carbon credit market is a way to also generate another income stream. The FairTrade carbon credit follows the gold standard methodology, so we look for projects that are related to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and reforestation and afforestation. And the three characteristics that FairTrade carbon credits offers are, for instance, democracy. So the owners of FairTrade carbon credits are always the producers. A minimum price, same in the philosophy of FairTrade, guaranteeing that the cost of, for instance, the adoption of the technology are incorporated in the final price, and transparency in the way we measure the trace of these carbon credits into the final market. I think I almost in my 10 minutes, so I would like to stop here and maybe open up the floor for the conversation.
Great. And actually, so I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their videos on. And I have some questions to pose for all of you, and then we'll go to the Q&A section, or go to the Q&A portion for the folks who submitted questions through the Q&A. And just as a reminder, now is a great time to submit questions. We've already gotten a few in to start with, but we want to see many more, so keep submitting them. Let's build, Leonardo, would you mind can you turn on we want to see you. Great, wonderful, thank you. So I want to build off of one of your last points, Juan Pablo, when you were talking about carbon pricing and carbon credits, well, more carbon credits than carbon pricing. But can you just explain for those folks who are joining us today who might not be familiar with what carbon credits are, and maybe also carbon pricing? And then I'm going to ask Leonardo and Maersk to talk about what role does carbon pricing and these kinds of systems play in their work?
Yeah, well, the whole discussion about carbon credits started in Kyoto in 97. So we had a long trajectory already. It relates to this concept of externalities. So if you are by your practices reducing the amount of CO2 emissions, that emission factor can be let's say, offer as a carbon credit. So it's the possibility to compensate your emission investing in a project that has a lower footprint or lower emission. This is in general. No? There's different methodologies to calculate that. It's a concept that sometimes is perceived as very abstract, and it's difficult because it's not tangible. No, it's not something that you can touch, and so for many people it's difficult to understand. But in simple ways, if you, by implementing, for instance, a renewable energy project, you are reducing the cost of opportunity of fossil fuels, for instance. So that differential is what you can offer as a carbon credit. We follow methodologies based on voluntary standards, methodologies that are being approved by the gold standard. So for instance, our projects relates to the installation of cook stoves in countries like India or Burkina Faso, or reforestation projects in Peru. So these are the type of projects that we try to look. But in the carbon market, there are other projects available, for instance, in transportation. If you change into more energy efficiency public transportation mechanisms, there's other ways to also offer carbon credits in the market. Now, prices, yeah, after Paris in 2015, we all of us that were working on climate change issues were cheering for a more stability of this abstract market. Unfortunately, the politics were not on our side, and there has been a lot of ups and downs. The carbon market, the price of carbon markets went really down. I remember 2017, 2018, to prices that were ridiculous, not even covering the cost of the whole operation. And it's also interesting to see how it behaves, because the same project in a country like, I'm just going to put an example, but as the same project in a country like Cambodia can be very appealing for the market, but compared to exactly the same project in another country like my own Costa Rica, because of the conditions of the country and then, yeah. So the prices are very unpredictable. We do think that the new changes in politics, like for instance, the government of Biden in the US or the European Green Deal, will give some stability to prices in the market, but yeah.
No, thank you for that. And thanks for that introduction. I mean, these are all different financial mechanisms, right? Ways to do market-based solutions to incentivizing reduction of CO2 emissions, whether it's through carbon price or, cap and trade program, or carbon credits that allow industries and individuals to buy offsets. So Mass, I mean, you're thinking about decarbonizing the entire shipping industry. I mean, it's a massive challenge. What role does carbon pricing offsets fit inside of this pathway?
Oh, you could say carbon pricing or carbon tax is fantastic in theory, because if you just put on a really hefty CO2 tax on fossil fuels, that could immediately close the gap to the synthetic e-fuels, e-methanol, or some of the others. So in theory, you could solve the problem very, very easily by putting a very large CO2 tax on. Realistically, though, that's not going to happen for a variety of reasons. One is that the revenue that would be generated from such a tax, how are you going to spend it? Who's going to get that money? And that will start a very large fight between a lot of countries, because you need to put it in internationally. Because if you put it in just one country and not another, shipping is a very mobile industry, and therefore all shipping activity would just move from one place to another. So you need to do it globally, and how do you then share the revenue? There are a number of ideas being floated right now that you could use the revenue and funnel it back into those that are shifting to the new green fuels. And that would, of course, be something that's worth considering, because that would also mean that the carbon tax that you apply could be much lower than if you just take the money out of the industry and use it elsewhere. because it's so difficult to do, Europe has right now opened up for introducing the emissions trading scheme for shipping, including shipping in that also. And that's probably the way that we're going to go, that there will be another market-based measure that in many ways resemble a carbon tax. And thereby you would start, you could say, applying a cost to emitting CO2. So it is a very useful or effective tool, but it's a very difficult one to introduce.
Yeah, and maybe to build upon that, when you're talking about decarbonizing the entire industry, are offsets, do they need to be, and that need to be part of the equation?
I don't think that you will have enough offsets in the world to offset 300 million tons of annual oil consumptions in shipping. Also because, you know, there are so many industries. I think it's much more realistic to work towards finding the real solution, which means not using fossil fuels in shipping.
Thanks, and Leonardo, I'm wondering how it plays inside of your tool and the transparency mechanisms that you're offering. You know, does carbon pricing come up? How are companies responding to that?
There's no direct correlation with carbon pricing, and in part because the supply chain carbon calculation is much easier to do than the things we help with, which are things like land use and forced labor. But I will say this: the supply chain transparency is used to obtain large amounts of green financing, so green bonds, premium payments for traceable commodities, co-investment from customers in projects like agroforestry projects, child labor prevention projects. So we're not seeing a lot of interest in the carbon financing, or maybe that problem isn't as complicated to figure out from the supply chain, but we're seeing that companies are getting better financing for their trade activities if they have the transparency and the dependability and the lower risk that's tied to transparent supply chains.
Well, then let me ask something that's a little bit more directly related to the tool that you've created. What do you see is the reasonable role of consumers when it's producers who make most of the decisions in bringing a product to market?
You know, consumers are not the driver of supply chain transparency. The brands themselves have been by far the biggest drivers, and some of the brands that have the most aggressive transparency and accountability in the supply chain, you would never know about it from their public presentation. They do it for their own values. They do it for their relationships that they are maintaining with their suppliers. They do it, and they see it as a strategic advantage. And many of those things that they do in the supply chain are not marketing focused. They're some of the things you do to make a supply chain sustainable are, frankly, not that glamorous. So there's a whole world of work being done on supply chains to make them more sustainable and make them more ethical. That has nothing to do with marketing, and I think that's a great thing. Consumers are a bit hamstrung. A single, candy bar can have thousands of farms that grew the cocoa and the palm oil and the sugar that contributed to it. So it's overwhelming for consumers by and large to make these decisions. So it's better for the consumers to look at the brand's overall supply chain disclosure and sustainability disclosure and make sure they buy from companies that reflect their values. And those values will be very different for different countries, different products, different programs. But there's no silver bullet. There's no grade letter. Every company is doing it in its own way.
Yeah, or they can look at a little FairTrade sticker that might be on their product. So Juan Pablo, what do you think about that? So what do you see as the role of consumers when it's producers who are choosing whether or not they volunteer to be part of FairTrade?
Yeah, well, as I explained, FairTrade, the philosophy of FairTrade is having partnerships between consumers and producers. So yeah, the message behind the logo of FairTrade, it's generating that relation between the decisions of the consumers at the end. We do believe in the what my colleagues from SIAT said, the domino effect. If a consumer is aware of their choices, then it's like a ripple effect. No, it trickles down to other actors of the supply chain. And in the whole conversation about sustainable food systems, raising the awareness of consumers is very important. Now, voluntary certification standards like FairTrade try to make that connection and communicate what is behind the product, because we as consumers often doesn't think in what is behind what I'm consuming. If I'm going to a supermarket and buy a banana, what is behind that banana? How it was produced, how it was transported, what is the nutritional value of that? Those are questions that we as consumers not necessarily ask ourselves. We do believe that it's important to raise the awareness of consumers and also showing them the reality of how these raw materials came about. How for instance, what has been the trace of deforestation in producing something. And it's quite complex, especially if you want to add different ingredients in a final package or final product, sorry. Some products are more easy to trace than others, but we do see that digital technologies are advancing in allowing us to have a better picture and a more comprehensive approach of how these products came about, what is, let's say, the footprint of that product at the end.
Actually, this brings up a point. Leonardo, does your tool have some kind of certification associated with it, like Juan Pablo's does? That they can use for marketing if they want it, if the companies wanted to?
They absolutely do. They use it for disclosure. No, we don't have any single standard that we adhere to, except transparency and data-driven responsible sourcing metrics. But our data is used to obtain FairTrade certification, Rainforest Alliance certification, organic certification, and dozens of others. So it's the, if you will, it's the raw data that can be used to satisfy a lot of these standards.
Great. I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'll direct it towards you, Mass, unless you have a response to that last question that you want to add. All right. Did you have anything you want to say about that question around the role of consumers and producers?
No, I think, you know, in the shipping context, consumers are the key to this. We're already seeing that in some segments of shipping, for instance, near the container trade, that there are customers who are interested in seeing that little green sticker on the box that they are having end up receiving, you could say. And particularly you see some of the large consumer brands and IKEA or an H&M and so on. They are already now very, very interested in being able to tell their customers, look, there was no CO2 emitted from bringing this piece of furniture or this clothing from where it was produced and onto your address. That can be a very powerful tool, I think, for a consumer company to be able to say that. We're doing some testing and some research on what can we actually expect that the consumers are willing to pay for having CO2-free transportation. And it's a bit in the early stage, because if you ask people, so how much would you pay for green transportation? They would give you a good answer. But at the purchasing point, you know, when they're about to push the button, when they're doing their internet purchase or down in the shop, you often see a different behavior than what people will tell you when you're asking them the question. But I guess that there is some research around that will give you more flavor to that. Right now, I think that there is a good willingness of a number of consumers to pay up to get that green transportation, and particularly consumer goods, if you're on a ferry trip, if you're on a cruise trip and so on. But I think there are also some shipping segments that are very far away from the consumer, where this willingness to pay is just not present. You know, a big shipping of iron ore, there's no consumer nearby, and I don't think there's anybody who will be willing to pay up to get green transportation yet. It will only be once this scope 1, 2, and 3 start hitting all the big companies, and they have to show exactly what emissions their business is contributing to. Then you'll start to see the pressure moving down the supply chain, and also ultimately hit the shippers of raw materials.
You know, Mass, that's a really good point. Here in the US, we don't even want to pay for shipping, let alone green shipping. I don't know, maybe people will be more interested in paying for green shipping than they would for normal shipping, but Amazon has really changed that for a lot of people. So it's interesting thinking about rolling it in. So it's not a consumer decision, that it's just standard practice. Of course, that's where we're all trying to get to.
You need to make it easy for the customer to make the decision. So it's not where they have to hit one button that's green and one that's black, but somehow make it the standard default solution that you get the green transportation. I think that's where we need to go, and I think it's going to get there, but it's going to take a little while.
So let me move on to one more question, and then I'll start going to the Q&A that people have submitted. So we don't have someone from the policy field here, but almost all of you mentioned how important policy is in making this kind of transformation. So what public official or group would you want to have a direct conversation with, and what would you advocate for in that conversation? And I'll go with Maersk first, and then we'll go to Juan Pablo and Leonardo.
Yeah, I think the first ones that I would really like to talk to would be the International Maritime Organization, because there is actually, in the industry of shipping, there is an international regulator, so that lays down regulation for the entire industry across the globe. And that means that they are very, very important. And once you could say they change the regulation, it impacts everything. So you don't have these leakage effects that you see from national regulation. They also operate by some sort of consensus, you could say, which means that they're not always moving the agenda as fast as you would like them to, simply because they need to get everybody on board. It doesn't work that they are just, you could say, implementing rules because it fits the EU or the US. You need to have the whole globe you could follow suit. And that means that sometimes it's a little bit slow, you could say, the climate regulation that you'd like to see. But IMO is the most important one for me. And then second, you could say the EU Commission. They are super focused on climate right now, and they're doing a lot of great things. And I would just want to, you could say, congratulate and urge them to do even more. And then, of course, there are the big nation states, the big shipping nations, that they would be third. But there are a lot of stakeholders that I'd like to talk to about decarbonizing shipping, and I'm trying my best.
Juan Pablo.
Yeah, we often engage, especially with the European Commission. We have an office, the FairTrade Advocacy Office in Brussels, that together with other voluntary sustainability standards that we are partners in the ICO group of work. We have different directions to understand regulations and normative, especially for international trade. So we try to engage in conversations with the World Trade Organization to understand what type of legislation is going to be in place. For instance, currently there's a lot of conversation happening with deforestation-free products, which take us back to the regions, to the origins where this where is our focus of work. And for instance, the case of cocoa is quite particular, because if you go back to countries like Cote d'Ivoire, where deforestation rates are extremely ridiculous, no? The country has been completely deforested over the past years. So the conversation with these policymakers is, well, yeah, it's okay, we are in favor of regulations, but how we can also go one step further and understand what type of incentives can be in place to reverse the pattern of deforestation and actually reforest again. So what type of incentives are going to be needed? Is this information? Is this about an extra price? Is about a little bit of push for nationally determined contributions? So these are the type of engagement in which my colleagues in the advocacy unit are try to engage with different actors in political arena.
Got it. Thank you. Leonardo.
I've had the good luck of speaking with the U.S. Senate Finance Committee and with various U.S. lawmakers around these enforcement of these laws that have recently started to be enforced for preventing the goods of forced labor from entering the U.S. So I'm feeling optimistic, but I would welcome the opportunity to talk to their analogs in the European Union, because they're in the process of implementing laws that will carry much more significant penalties for companies that don't know or are found to have problems in their supply chain stemming from forced labor. And so that's the key. Right now, I think the companies are scrambling to find out what the standards are for the evidence required to show that they've done enough diligence on their extended supply chains to prevent goods of forced labor from entering. And governments have now proposed a solution that is data-driven. And so I'd like to connect the supply and the demand of data for making everyone's lives easier and really preventing these goods from being smuggled into these ports.
Thank you for those great questions. Okay, so here are some questions that have come in through the Q&A. So first, this one's from Marcus. Do you already have a project in place? This isn't to one particular person, so just, take yourself off mute or raise your hand if you want to answer this one. Do you already have a project in place where partners of a specific supply chain are working together in the sense of supply chain management? So I think what they're talking about is up and down the supply chain. So supplier, producer, wholesaler, retailer, consumers.
Maybe I can jump in here because this is a part of what I explained. One of the strategies that we try to come up is what we call offer to business. So a commercial partner works together with the producer organization in a different, let's say, climate-oriented project, and that it's communicated towards the end consumers as well. So this is part of one of the strategies that we, as a system, encourage to confront the issue of climate change. There's different examples, and if someone wants, they can reach me out later, and I can go in deep in one of the examples.
Thank you. Mass, you have something that you want to add too?
Yeah, I mean, our whole center is built up around that notion that you need to have the entire supply chain built into the work that you're doing, because if you're just zooming in on one particular spot, you will not get the full traction. I mean, if you look at, we have in our partnership, we have engine manufacturers of shipping engines, we have shipbuilders, we have fuel producers, we have shipping companies, and we even have the customer side, for instance, like Cargill, that is a big customer to the shipping industry. So by finding solutions where we have, or where you put together projects that include the entire supply chain, you find much better and much more robust solutions to the decarbonization challenges that you have by having the whole supply chain present in those projects. So it's super important question you're asking, and it's definitely something we build our center around.
And I'm assuming, Leonardo, you have do you have companies in the same supply chain, right? That's that part of the business model that you have companies up and down the supply chain that are using your tool?
Yeah, we only have projects. The whole purpose of our tool is for multiple tiers of companies that do business with each other to collaborate. So yeah, we only have collaborative projects. Great.
I think that's a pretty unique aspect of the tool. All right, this is a question from Maria. This is a question for all of you. What is your perspective on life cycle assessments, LCAs, of products? Is it feasible to implement and use on a broad scale? Is it helpful? How does it tie in with supply chains? Maersk, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It is super important, and it is absolutely crucial for getting the right solutions. I can give you one example. If you produce, for instance, synthetic methanol, where you take out, you could say, or where you take carbon from the air and put together with hydrogen, and then you have a fuel that you will then consume on your vessel and emit CO2. But in essence, you take out CO2 and then you put it back into the air. So the net effect from using that is zero. But if you only focus on what happens on the ship, you will see CO2 emissions and think that it's as bad as normal fossil fuel. You could also take something similar, for instance, ammonia. If you use that as a fuel on board your ship, it emits no CO2. But it can easily be that ammonia has been produced from natural gas, and in the production process, there was a huge amount of CO2 emitted. then you'd end up with a fuel that looks really, really good on paper, but it is actually causing as much CO2 pollution as the fossil fuels. So you can have many examples that if you only look at particular segments, you'll get the entirely wrong conclusions. So you need to take the full life cycle analysis into perspective when you find your solutions. And here you need to take scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 when you analyze the supply chains. And you need to not just focus on CO2, you need to look at the other greenhouse gases as well. So take a comprehensive picture, because otherwise you will end up maybe with something that slips a lot of methane into the atmosphere that is much, much more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is, and you'll end up with a solution that's much worse. So you need to take the full picture, and if you don't do that, you'll end up with suboptimal solutions. So thanks for that question. It's really important.
Juan Pablo or Leonardo, do you want to add anything there, or should I go on to the next question?
Yeah, no, likewise, like Maersk has said, we do also recognize the importance of life cycle analysis, especially if you really want to address the whole aspect of the final product. And it's difficult. Again, it's not the same in our case. For instance, it's not the same if you analyze, for instance, the footprint of a bag of coffee compared to sugar, which is more complicated to trace. But yeah, life cycle analysis help us to have a better picture, a better approach to that.
Great, thank you. So we actually have questions from two people that I'm going to combine. We have Helmut and Sarah. So in all of your work, you're looking up and down the supply chain, and as Sarah writes, transportation is clearly a necessity for moving goods from producer to consumer. How much can or should the middleman or broker be reduced or simplified in a lower carbon world? And then Helmut's question is, what are realistic ways to reduce transportation in general, if that's, and is that part of the equation here? I mean, Mads, when you're talking about going carbon neutral in the shipping industry, I'm assuming most of the conversation isn't actually about reducing the miles shipped, right?
I think there will be a number of miles shipped that will be reduced. For instance, there's a lot of transportation of fossil fuel right now with crude oil being moved around, with diesel, with gasoline, and of course being moved. And over time, we would need to see that stop. Instead, there could be, you could say, the transportation of some of the synthetic fuels, like ammonia or e-methanol and so on, that are zero carbon. And that means that's fine, that's great. We'll also see the electrification, of course, of industries that would probably mean that you need to transport less liquid fuel. So over time, you could think that energy transportation will probably go down, and that's fine. That's a good thing. A lot of countries would actually be interested in having their own energy production and not be so reliant on a few other nations as they are right today. But I think overall, you can have a big discussion about whether international trade is a good or bad thing. I'm an economist. I tend to think that trading is good. It makes everybody use their skills in the best manner, and it's actually, we're all better off with having more trading. So yeah, we can discuss that. There will be some people that think that shortening the supply chains can be good and make life simpler. But I don't think that's the way we'll be heading.
All right, so we have a question here, and Juan Pablo, might be more towards you, from Roberto. I'm originally from Brazil, where many people believe that the agricultural expansion can actually be done properly and shouldn't damage the rainforest. Current deforestation would be a result of illegal practices, selling wood or occupying land. Do you agree? Do you have any thoughts or recommendations?
Yeah, it's a tough one because it relates to what type of land use were in place before. What we see is that many wild areas have been converted into productive land, and again, that is one of the aspects of lack of transparency. And the issue of incentives. Sometimes I've seen that in my working experience, a good intention in a policy is incentivizing actually deforestation and bad practices. So yeah, it is difficult to say. There's a lot of consensus now that in agriculture in general, we should promote agroecology as a way forward and integrate more the analysis of biodiversity of the farm, and not just the mechanization, large-scale monocropping systems, but try to integrate more biodiversity, more trees, and different aspects in the production per se to try to restore. In some regions, the degradation is very hard, and so it's also the importance to have a financial mechanism to restore and revert degradation of ecosystems. So it depends on the context and the incentives that are around. But in general, I will say that at least our scope of work and our focus goes into better sustainable practices, good agriculture practices, and more balance between environmental assets and social responsibility.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying about how providing financial incentives, right, to reforest, to afforest, but then also potentially education and training so that there can be farms within forests and there isn't that kind of devastating clear cutting that's happening now.
Yeah, that's, again, it's one of the examples of this offer to businesses. Together with commercial partners, we invest in climate academies. We invest with people to understand what are the challenges and what are the drivers of climate change and how to come up with solutions. Copying what my colleagues have said, there's no silver bullet. Every context is different. But if you, as a producer, have more tools and you are better informed, your resilience will be higher, and then you will come up with a different, with an appropriate solution, more suitable for your conditions. Yes, investing in education is important. It's crucial.
Thank you. So we have a question that's come in from Lawrence. Very specific question, which is Amazon currently more part of the solution or part of the problem? Thoughts on that? Leonardo, are they one of your customers? Are they one of your clients?
I mean, they're definitely part of our solution because we're hosted on Amazon Web Services servers around the world.
Oh, Juan Pablo, you're unmuted. Okay, you're back now.
Maybe it refers to one of the questions that you raised before about consumer choices. Whether Amazon is part of the solution or not depends a little on the awareness of consumer and the willingness. So what are we doing to educate the consumers? This is an important aspect as well.
And I'd say, at least in the states where I am, there's huge consumer interest in reducing the impact. I mean, everybody I talk to complains about how many boxes they get. We still order on Amazon, right? They still order, but they complain about the packaging and the boxes, and you're seeing some small changes happening. All right, so let's I'll wrap it up with a question for each of you to answer, and then I'll hand it over to our session hosts. So what is the one takeaway that you want our participants to get from today's conversation? Let's go Leonardo, Juan Pablo, and then we'll end with Mas.
Just that transparency is not the choice anymore. So the real challenge now is going to be how to make it work for business. And we're certainly full of ideas, but I think there's a really untapped potential how to take transparency and make it work for you.
Yeah, and if I am to put one point in, is to say that decarbonization of transportation, of shipping is perfectly doable. The technology is there, the fuels are there. The only thing we need to do is to have some private-public partnerships working together to ensure that the cost between the new fuels and the old fuels come closer to each other, so that we start to get the train rolling, because it is going to happen, and we can only speed it up by working together. So it is happening, and we just need to push it, to accelerate it.
And I will say that, well, I think I already said that severity and frequency of meteorological events are on the rise, and there's no doubt about that. Unfortunately, we are still in this area of understanding what needs to happen and what is the solution. But in some sectors, there's no silver bullets. So we have to be, again, very cautious and very understandable of the contexts. But there's something that is important. We as consumers, we have a political power in our hands when we decide to purchase something. So try to be more aware and concerned about what is behind that product that you are going to purchase, and that can make the difference.
All right, so we have that transparency is here. It's here to stay. Get on board. If you're not already, it's coming to you. We have that decarbonizing shipping is completely possible. We just need these public-private partnerships in order to launch it and take it to making it reality, to equalize the cost of these different fuels, low carbon competitive fuels. And then the power of the consumer. Climate change is here, it's real, we're experiencing it, farmers around the world are experiencing it, and consumers actually have a lot of power in their decision making. So thank you so much to our panelists for this wide-ranging conversation. I really appreciate your time and also your passion and commitment to this area. You know, we're all counting on you to make some big changes here, and we'll do our part too. And with that, let me pass it over to Peter. All right, Peter, we want to hand it over to you. You're currently muted. All right, Peter, we're still not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Great, go for it.
Okay, wrong button. Okay, so first and foremost, Laura, JP, Leo, Matt, thank you so much. It was a great time. I think everyone learned a lot today. And you know it already, but we talked a lot about carbon credits and CO2. So we really want to thank you from a Club of Germany perspective and give each of you a climate action certificate on offset of 5 tons of CO2. As a thank you from the club, you will receive it in a nice frame you can put on your wall. And that's an interesting thing, because we calculated actually our CO2 footprint from an event perspective. Yeah, MIT is known for the geeky stuff and the numbers. So according to an MIT study, a Zoom meeting produces 150 grams of CO2 an hour. So we went about 2 hours, that's 300 grams, but we offset 20 tons, so 20 million grams. So we actually CO2 negative, which I think is positive, of course, and we will continue on our path from a club perspective to also contribute it a little bit to a negative CO2 footprint. What we do here is a reforestation project in Germany, FYI, and I think that's nicely tied in some of the stuff that we heard today. Otherwise, we have a couple of great partners, as you know. If any one of you in the meeting here or in the webinar is interested to support us and partner with us, just send me an email address. I'm responsible for partnerships at the MIT Club of Germany, and we sure find a solution to something together in the future. And then I end with a last slide and I then let you go, guys. And thank you very much for staying so long in the evening, especially here in Europe. That's a list of the upcoming events. We have 2 events before the summer break. We have a fireside chat on climate policy on the 8th of July. We have a climate solution simulation workshop with the MIT En-ROADS methodology towards the end of July. We usually open up registrations 4 to 6 weeks before the event. So you would see the registration live early June for the 8th of July event on climate policy. You can find then the registration like you found this registration on our website. You can also follow us, the MIT Club of Germany, on LinkedIn, where we will publish once the registration is open. We have a couple of topics for the second half of the year. Still working through the specific timing, but stay with us. Thank you very much for you guys to come onto the call. Thank you again for our panelist and moderator, and I wish you a nice evening and stay sustainable. Bye, guys.